This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 58 of the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. This episode is brought to you by Photo Tees, offering you wearable art using my unique and beautiful designs and photos. Check them out at www.flanaganphotos.com, spelled Flanaganphotos. Today I have with me well-known landscape photographer Gary Crabbe, and we're going to discuss composition in landscape photography. Welcome back, Gary.
Hi, Kirby. Thank you so much for inviting me back with you. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure's all mine, I assure you. So there are at least three approaches to composition in landscape photography. There's the follow the rules group, the bend the rules group, and then there's the ignore the rules group or the artistic approach. Where do you fit in that spectrum?
Well, I could probably say easiest where I don't fit. The reason I got into photography was that I couldn't draw worth a darn. I had no artistic skill, and even when I had to draw a stick figure, that was questionable. So I don't have an art background, an art history, and I kind of fuddle against this, I'm going to break every rule just for the sake of breaking every rule. So that's probably the camp I am least associated with. I would probably say the middle ground in general. I tend to follow the rules because they're rules for a reason. And those rules have developed around basically a psychological and physiological response to visual stimuli. So I tend to follow the rules, but I have no problem breaking them. I appreciate that there are always exceptions to the rules. And I love when I either do it on purpose or it happens out of a happy accident. But I'm not something that's going to say, oh, well, because it doesn't follow the rules, it should go into the trash can. And, as someone who has spent many, many years judging for local camera clubs, reviewing portfolios from other photographers, that, there are people out there that will say, oh, if it doesn't follow rules A, B, C, or D, it's automatically a negated or degraded photo for whatever reason. So I'm definitely not as strict adherence, but I understand why there are rules. So the rules kind of guide me, but they're not like a barbed wire fence that I'm going to cross.
Okay. So you don't get involved in doing compositing or any of that sort of stuff?
No, actually, now that you mention it, I have done a grand total that I can think of. In fact, I was just doing a presentation last week where I was joking around with this idea that's going on in landscape photography now about perspective distortion and perspective blending. And I prefaced it with well, this is how you do it, but I definitely don't, it's not my thing. It's not my style, where I was able to stretch a mountain to make it look taller. No, I don't do any of that. I think if I have really think back, I've probably done some compositing on a total of maybe less than 5 images. And it has generally always been to maintain the natural aspect of a scene as opposed to deliberately adding something that wasn't there. In other words, one time way back with film, I did a shot of an oak tree and a moon with a 500 millimeter lens. I may have even had a double extender on it, and there was no way I could get the moon and the tree sharp in a single frame. So I took 2 shots, one with a silhouetted oak tree that was sharp and one with a moon that was sharp. And I brought the sharp moon into the frame with the sharp oak tree so that it had a very natural look. I think the other thing that I might have done on a couple occasions is just work with different wave splashes to either reveal a rock that was hidden in one frame or add a splash that was from another frame. But that's been about it.
Okay. So talk a little bit about this perspective distortion. I guess I haven't kept up with that.
Oh, well.
Or if you'd rather
one
not.
Of the famous landscapes in the West, as I'm sure you're aware of, is this beautiful shot. In fact, I was just there within the last couple weeks. It's from the Alabama hills looking at Mount Whitney, which it's cradled in this beautiful little cirque that you can frame up nice and tightly with maybe a 300 millimeter lens or a 200 millimeter lens. And between Mount Whitney and Keeler Needle and some of the other spires that are nearby, it is just this beautifully majestic, iconic shot of what also happens to be the highest point in the contiguous U.S. at 14,500 feet.
Right.
And it's this idea that people will take shots and they'll use like a transform in Photoshop to like stretch the mountains upwards so that they have a taller, thinner, more shark-like tooth type appearance. And that is one aspect. And the other aspect that I've heard and seen about before is that people will take a wide angle shot of an alpine valley. Let's say, for example, looking out over the North Cascades up in Washington State, or possibly the Canadian Rocky Mountains. And I've seen these examples all the way from the Dolomites and other photographers traveling through parts of the European Alps or the Himalayan Alps. They'll take a wide angle shot, especially with something in the foreground close up, like a field of flowers or a running creek or something like that. But the distant mountains, because you're using a wide angle, 14 or 24 millimeter lens, the mountains way off in the background look so puny.
Right.
So they'll take a second shot with those mountains at like, a 70 or 100 millimeter frame. And then they'll put the background mountains with the telephoto shot into the wide angle shot with the foreground. So now you have the foreground with these big, massive, overly exaggerated mountains in the background. And it's part of this constructivism of new landscape photography that has appeared really over the last 10 years to create the epic landscape. I've just come to call them fantasy-scapes. I mean, because they are trying to show a scene that is, oh my God, this looks almost too good to be real. And in fact, that often proves to be the case. They're fabulous photos, but they're almost bordering on as much photo art. They're constructed landscapes, and it's a very attractive style, gets lots of visual response, and I am even one to admit there's a lot of it out there I really enjoy seeing. Some of it appears to go to a point that some might call over the top. Some may respond to it even more harshly than I do. And I don't respond to it that harshly myself, but I understand it's like, well, okay, that's nice. I don't think that's what it would look like if I was there. And so that's kind of where I draw the difference with my own work.
Okay. So you're very much a traditionalist, I guess, fair to say.
Yeah, I was kind of like, get it right in the field. I'm trying to, I want my own images to be kind of dramatic, but as if you were standing there. Yes, this is kind of what you would see.
Okay, fair enough. So how do you use depth of field in your photos? Seems to be one of those things that some photographers at least tend to ignore.
And give me an example of what you mean by that.
Of course, I do mostly wildlife photography anymore, but have a photo where everything's in sharp detail from foreground to background, including all the junk in the background, I guess.
Right, the classic F-64 crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, has its place, but there's a place for showing depth of field near medium distance, far distance, to give more of a three-dimensional effect. So I guess that's what I'm driving at.
Okay, yeah, no, I hear you. So again, that also tends to fall into this constructivism aspect in some regard, where that extreme depth of field is now at play. And photographers will spend a great amount of time in the field to get every little bit from an extreme close-up of flowers that are maybe like 12 inches from the front of a camera frame all the way to infinity. So they'll do focus stacking, they'll do exposure stacking, 20 or 30 frames to build up a particular scene, really to emphasize that extreme depth of field. And sometimes they are done with fabulous style and approach. And to your point, I don't often see a lot of selective depth of field or the use of selective depth of field, especially in landscape photography, because I think people see a lot of these really kind of extreme landscapes and they see how much response that they generate, and so they see this as a role model that they want to emulate. It's kind of like a growing visual school or style of photography, where I tend to be a little bit different, and it sort of discounts depth of field to some extent. But when people ask me as a landscape photographer what my favorite lens is, they're usually expecting me to say something like, a 14 to 24, a 17 to 35, some wide angle lens, maybe my 24 to 70, but it's actually my telephoto lens. So I've always loved the compression of the landscape that the telephoto lens uses. To that, I usually don't worry about if there's a small strip of foreground that goes out of focus, because that will act as like a framing element or something like that. When I'm working with the more wide angle or mid-range telephoto, somewhere in the 70 millimeter range, then I really love the use of a selective point of focus and a shallower depth of field. And as talking about composition, and maybe I should have actually prefaced this a little bit at the start when we talked about this. When I give presentations or workshops or in my consulting, the primary focus, I go into everything related to photography, is as a communication medium. And so everything about photography, from the equipment to your vision to your composition to your choice of exposure and equipment, all boils down to what story are you trying to tell with your photo? And photography at its very, very heart, when it all boils down to like a prime factorization, photography is a communication medium. And that is something that should stick in the photographer's brain from the moment they walk out the door thinking they're going to take a picture, and long before they even pick up a camera, is drilling that sense. And the use of a selective depth of field in part of a compositional element is a wonderful way for the photographer to tell a viewer, here is what I want you to look at. And so a great way of doing that is, not worrying or not trying to get everything sharp in the frame, especially if it's like a mid-ground shot. One of the things I think about would be like trunks of aspen trees, where in the foreground you have some blurry foliage down in the bottom part of the frame. In the midground, you have some wonderfully sharp aspen trees, and in the background, everything then falls out soft again. It's because you're saying, look, the crap in the foreground isn't important. I don't care if you want to see all this stuff in the background. I don't want you to see that. So I focus only on the stuff I want you to see. And in that case, using the right depth of field seems to be the appropriate way to do that. So that's the, it all boils down. What am I trying to show in a photo? What's the story I want to say? So that's the kind of, thought that I'm always using in the field. Sorry, I tangent off there, but yeah, it's all about the communication aspect. So
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So I wanted to talk for just a minute about leading lines. If anything, they tend to be overused, in my opinion, particularly by beginning photographers. But what are your thoughts about them?
Sure. So I can almost imagine how you respond to this idea that they are overused, especially in landscapes, because it does seem like it's one of those maybe first 3 or 4 compositional rules that photographers are taught.
Right.
Rule of thirds, leading lines. Okay, let's say it's the second thing that people are taught in that particular order. What I stated back at the start of this was how I understand the rules in terms of psychology and physiology. And to that, I add in what I was just saying about photography is communication. It is how we combine elements in this visual story, in this tiny little frame that we've got, to tell the viewer, here is what we want you to look at. And the composition acts like this constraint, and how our eye travels through the frame is based in part on physiology, and how we respond to that emotionally is kind of based on psychology. And my old boss, Galen Rowell, has written a seminal book, what I consider one of the best books really written on the subject, which was his book Mountain Light. And the subtitle of that book was In Search of the Dynamic Landscape. And the part when I used to sit and work through maybe 40 of Galen's workshops during my decade-long tenure there, he would always talk about this idea of dynamic, and that part of that relates to composition. Meaning there are some things our brains like, and there are some things our brains don't like, i.e., straight vertical or horizontal lines are stagnant, whereas diagonal lines are dynamic. They just have to engage our brain an extra percentage. So we go, ooh, splattering something like a rose in the middle of your frame, I call it visual splat. Your brain just goes, okay, bang, there it is. It's stagnant. It doesn't engage our brain. But if you suddenly put two flowers off angle, one out of focus in the background, one in focus, and they're slightly offset, our brain is like, oh, wow, okay, I have to do a little extra work to take in this subject. And it is those simple things like leading lines and S-curves. Yes, they may seem cliche, and yes, they may certainly be overdone, but they are probably a very strong part of guiding our eye through a frame. And so when you're dealing with wildlife, or nature detail shots, your subject is usually singular. And bam, this is what I want you to see. Where landscape photography, there are usually more of a multitude of subjects. It could be rocks, flowers, streams, background trees, mountains, clouds, sunsets, and you want your viewer to entangle all of them together, but you also want it to happen in such a way that your brain responds to it well, not like, oh, this is a confusing mess, I don't know what you want me to look at. The other side of that coin is, most beginning photographers, when they walk out to a beach, will split that horizon exactly 50-50. And what they're doing is they're forcing the viewer to make a choice. What's most important, the sky or the landscape? Because they haven't made it. So using these lines like leading lines and S-curves is just the visual artist manipulating the viewer's eye through a frame so that they can say, I want you to see this, and to have it be a relatively easy path. Because once that path becomes cluttered, I mean, just imagine going through. Now, you live in Nevada. I can tell you, I was just going through Las Vegas, and the highway construction there was nuts. You know, there were lane changes and cones and stuff and detours everywhere. If your brain has to do that to a visual story, you're going to wind up feeling like you're in a traffic jam, and the end result is visual frustration. So, yeah, I understand it, but I mean, I'm sure you can understand why they're used as much as they are too, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So that's, yeah. I don't know how you get away from it being used as much, but I don't know how to respond to the overuse aspect of it. You know, they're there for a reason.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, let me ask you. So you kind of led to this idea of, overuse or cliche. So as a wildlife shooter, tell me, I'm interested to hear kind of what is your side of the fence on that? Why does it seem like it's cliche or overused?
Just from looking at a lot of landscape photos over the years, I guess, as much as anything. I mean, I did a lot of landscape when I started out and enjoyed it, but, seemed like you were taking the same picture that everybody else was taking, and somehow I never managed to grow beyond that. So I changed to wildlife photography because it was a different form of challenge, I guess, in short. That doesn't really answer your question, but
yeah, no, actually it does, because I can really appreciate that, having been doing landscape so much. I have gotten to a point where I completely really have no interest in going out and just taking the same old shot that everyone else is out clamoring to get. If I come across something, sure, but I don't necessarily go and, just another rock and stream photo is just that. It's just another rock and stream photo. I've gotten to a point though where it doesn't drive me, because I'm not learning, or it's not producing anything new. But if I do come across an exceptional scene, I mean, I'll happily take it. There are 1,000 shots of owls in the trees. But if I see an owl in a tree or a coyote in a field, you better believe I'll probably take it. So I know the feeling, and the way the growth of photography has just been inundating our visual senses with so much of it, since the digital revolution happened. Is
no doubt about that one.
Everything has increased exponentially. Yeah. The struggle for something new.
Right. So let's switch topics and talk about the use of contrast. Obviously, the grand master of that was Ansel Adams, and it makes sense in black and white. What do you think about using it in color photography?
Great question. And you were speaking to someone who had probably, when I was going to college, my only formal photography training was in black and white. I had one, and it was literally, photography 101 in college. One basic black and white course. but as a student, I had Ansel Adams posters, Ansel Adams calendars that were cut up. I had Ansel Adams postcard sets, and they were thumbtacked over my entire college wall in my apartments back then, so that I had lived basically in my own Ansel Adams gallery for years. And then surprisingly, when I got into photography, which happened to start with me being a photo editor first and a novice photographer, I learned photography through my years of doing photo editing. Color and the contrast of color, and like I said, I'm not an artist. I don't know, color theory. I don't know all the nuances that like an art history major would know about. But I know a very, very simple rule. Contrast of colors works amazing in helping to tell stories and add visual interest. And it is basically contrast between warm and cool colors, just like you would use light and dark. Reds against greens, yellows against blacks, blues and yellows together. Any contrast that deals with warm and cool. And I basically explained, so I've done a number of presentations lately where I talk about my processing workflow and how, other than, a little bump up in initial vibrance, I generally don't add too much color. But the one area that I do add a tiny bit of a saturation bump is through the split toning tool in Lightroom. And I will usually bias the highlights to a slightly warm, yellowish, orange, or golden. And I will slightly bias the shadows to a cooler, bluer color. And then I'll slide the balance tool just so that it favors the highlights. Why? And again, it boils down to that psychology aspect that our brains respond well to warmer colors. When I got my master's degree in theater, we had to go through a lighting design course. And one of the things I remembered most was like how you would use blues to set an evening mood, or, a dark mood, or something that was impending. You would use green if you want to make something look sickly. In fact, I once had a book that the publisher, I can't even remember how they approved it, but the entire book was printed dark, muddy, and green. It was like the grossest thing I've ever seen. I really never even showed it to a client, but it spoke so strongly to the psychological effect of color that we might not even be aware of. And when you can place those warm and cool colors contrasting against each other, it just adds to that visual dynamicism that, I had mentioned earlier. It just keys our brain just the same way as light and darks. Warm and cool colors work exactly the same way. And, essentially, like, I'm sure you've seen these now, people are really biasing some of their landscape photos to be really dark and magenta with just this little glow of bright light coming off on the side. It's a very, again, a constructed methodology. And they choose this dark and magenta color for whatever reason, it looks dramatic when it's featured against that spot of bright white or golden light. And it just, it adds to this impact of the image. So yeah, definitely as important as any other sort of contrast, I would say. Yeah.
There's definitely a trend, at least online, towards everything being oversaturated.
Well, oversaturation is, even since like some of the early days of HDR, the phrase I have is that hue of cyan does not occur naturally on this planet. And I see it all the time in snow and in shadows and, in corners of skies and stuff like that. And it is like this bullet point that says, oh, someone just amped up the saturation and stuff like that. So, yeah, there's a fine line. I always tell people, it's like, push it to where you think it looks right and then back off by 10 or 15%.
Yeah, it's a good rule of thumb.
Yeah. Try and do it. And every once in a while, I've come back and after looking at one of my own shots and have seen something where something went too far, like a shot in some redwood trees. And I had processed it all. And then, a year later, I'm just looking at it and it's like, those greens are just a little too green. And, right. I know it kind of looked good, but it just gave that image, even if it was a percentage that was like 10 or 15% too green or too rich. It just, I could tell it crossed a line for me in retrospect, and I actually went and reprocessed the image and just toned that down. So, I like I said, I like natural, I like dramatic, but I don't believe on slathering so much color. If you have to slather color to make your image appear dramatic, it's kind of like a crutch that people use, ultra super high glossy paper. And I remember my old boss said, if you need glossy paper to create visual impact with your image, you're not doing it right. It's a crutch. It's just like artificially boosting something for the sake of boosting it. But sadly, or not sadly, people just respond to it. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's funny you say that because I've had that experience too fairly recently, going back and looking at photos that were a year or two old and saying to myself, I wonder why I did that,
Well, to top on that conversation, and I think he wound up admitting it to himself at one point, so I will go ahead and use his name because I know it's come up in the past. One of my favorite Southwest landscape photographers, especially back in the day of large format, has always had a beautiful gallery in Moab, Utah, was Tom Till. And I thought he did some fantastic stuff. And then a number of years ago, he got online and started posting some digital work. And it was like, oh my God, his saturation slider went to 200. And it was over and over and over again. And I think there was finally enough people going, Tom, what are you doing? That he finally kind of went, yeah, I think you guys are right. I think I was probably going a bit overboard on that. And he toned it down. Now it's only like 120. So I mean, it's still far more overboard than what I think his old film stuff was. But we all go through these transitions, and how people use one tool or one element of their storytelling changes over time, and that's okay. And some people may respond positively to the change, and others maybe not so much. But it's all okay. There's no rights and wrongs. It's everyone each to their own, and we can all decide what we do or don't like.
Right. So shifting gears again, how do you like to use shapes in telling your story in landscape photography?
Interesting. I don't know if I consciously think of shapes per se too much in my approach to landscape photography. I think what matters more to me is a visceral reaction to a scene I have when I come upon, and that it either stirs something in me at that moment, so that what my first line of attack with any composition or framing is when I'm looking out at the visual world saying, what do I like? And it may be a subject or an element, but as a natural reaction, my first kind of consideration has to be, what is the shape of that object and relative to any background that I've got, or what am I trying to isolate, or what is catching my interest? And so obviously I can think of like the boulders out in the buttermilk region of the Eastern Sierra. Some of them are very round. Some of them have very sharp diagonal edges or lines. Are there shadows? Because shadows are actually the thing that helps give three-dimensional objects their shape in a two-dimensional medium. So how are the shadows working to emphasize the shape? Obviously, the easy thing is something that's linear, like a tree trunk, or curved, like a stream, or circular, like boulders, or close-ups of flowers, which I don't tend to do a lot of, but they're at play as part of the story. But the first thing I have to say is, what's the story? What am I trying to show? And then how does whatever that object or that subject's shape come into play with the rest of the elements in its scene? For one example, one of the things I say is that sometimes just because something is horizontal or vertical doesn't mean you need to show it in a frame as a horizontal or vertical. The simple idea of looking straight up at a tree and then twisting your camera a few degrees suddenly creates a diagonal. How does that diagonal work if it's portrayed against the canopy of another tree in the background? Maybe now you're helping lines to match up. And this was another lesson I actually had learned from my old boss, was a concept, and I've continued to pass this along as part of my own teaching. and that really resonated with me was the idea of creating order out of chaos. So whenever we walked out into the natural world, it's a visually chaotic place. But whenever you can impose this perceived sense of order between non-related elements or non-related subjects, i.e., look at the way the shape of these rocks mimics the shape of the clouds, or look at the way the shape of this tree fits so nicely in between this little valley in the background landscape, or the shape of a tree set against a cloud or a sky so that the branches just seem like they fit perfectly. Those are the sorts of choices that I'm making, and it's not like I'm going to go out and photograph triangles, or I'm thinking in terms of rectangles or circles. I'm thinking about, the shape of the object and how I want, someone's eye to travel through a frame. That could be triangular. I could have someone's eye looping through a frame in a very oval feel or a very diagonal feel. Those visual lines count to me, but I'm not a cubist, or again, I don't know the art history of how or why people do it consciously. I just, I know how I do it when I stumble into the field and see whatever I'm seeing. And this is something I told the people, is like, I don't know how I'm picking out a composition. I just hear the landscape or the subject speaking to me, and that's where I point my camera. So most of it's happening in the brain first, and I'm not even really aware that I'm doing it till people ask me about it. Well,
yeah, that's kind of the way it works for me too. I just thought I was weird, but nice to know somebody else approaches it that way.
Yeah, it's weird how it works. Is that it's you show up and it's like, bam, there it is. I know what it is. I've used an example in my presentations about a rose bush. And you'll see there are two types of photographers. There's one type that wanders all around, tries every different position, thinks about every different lens, and finally gives up and basically takes a snapshot. And there are other photographers who walk up and go, oh my God, look at that rose bush, and knows exactly what lens to pick out, exactly how they want to frame it, takes the shot, and everyone looks at that shot and goes, wow, that's beautiful. It's just the way the photographer connects to their subject, and the subject speaks, the combination of passion and interest and all that fun stuff at play.
So being a traditionalist, do you stick to shooting at the golden hour, or are you willing to hold out later in the day?
So I would say yes, I am kind of a little biased to the golden hour. In part of that is, as I mentioned, the warmth of the light, but it's also the way these shadows work on the landscape, to add a sense of shape or a sense of visual contrast or something like that. So I love long shadows and stuff like that. You generally only get those when the sun is lower in the sky. But it doesn't necessarily have to be golden. I love, the blue hour, where you get that beautiful kind of cobalt blue light, steel cold blue. In the middle of the day, and this was really interesting because I've mentioned this before in my old job as the photo editor and manager of this image library, we used to deal with a bunch of international agencies. And when we think of here's like our American genre of landscape photography, those beautiful golden sunsets and alpenglow colors and majestic, glowing red and purple clouds are the things that elicit all the oohs and ahs, and all the other photographers want to try and go out and capture and make their own little versions of. Yet we had a agent, in fact, I still have the same agent who's based in Japan. And back in the day when they used to do all of their stock image sales through printed catalogs, this was before the internet, so I'm dating myself. Agencies would send out these massive catalogs of stock photos to photo buyers saying, here's some great images, come buy them. But surprisingly, the Japanese, they didn't like the sunrise or sunset shots. They loved middle of the day, high noon, the bluer and freshest green postcard blue and green shots. The sort of shots where we as American photographers might be, like myself, camera in the bag, possibly sleeping in the back of your truck somewhere because the light was so boring. We call it these days severe clear or bluebird skies, just bright blue. And so I've always kind of kept that notion of there's a cultural difference at play here between what people like. And so I try not to keep myself totally closed off to it. Is there a chance that on the middle of a bright, clear blue day, I won't take a photo? Yes, and I could tell you that's happened as recently as 2 weeks ago. And I was driving through Death Valley on my way from Las Vegas toward the Eastern Sierra, and my original plan might have been, if there was anything visually interesting going on with the light, I might have spent a night in Death Valley. And it was about as severe, clear blue as you could have possibly imagine. Not even a hint of a breeze. It was like 82 degrees already in March or something like that. 87 degrees at the beginning of March. And I just kind of did a visual assessment. I've got a nice new Death Valley gallery on my website that I've put up there, and I'm looking around going, is there anything I need, or is there anything I'm motivating me under these lighting conditions? And at that point I just said, no. And I just made a straight beeline for the Alabama hills.
Yeah,
but to contrast that, I could be out in the Central Valley of California and looking out at these amazing orchards or fields of growing crops. And there, the bright sunny blue skies are a perfect complement to the subject. And I could happily work those at any hour of the day, anytime. So that's...
Yeah, part of photography is learning when not to take the picture. I think that's another somewhat cliche, but very, very much true as you progress through your photography career.
I think I remember actually possibly Art Wolf saying something like that as, one of the great big leaps in a photographer's education standpoint is knowing when not to take a photo. And, I certainly have bypassed numbers of photos. I've certainly made wrong choices and regretted thinking, no, I won't take that, or I'll wait till the next time, and the next time doesn't show up, or I hit myself after the fact saying I should have stopped. I did. We all have to make those kind of judgment calls, sometimes for better or worse.
Well, there's lots more we could talk about, but we're kind of out of time. So before we go, why don't you tell people where to find you and your work so they know?
Sure. I have a website. It's under my company name, or it's a contraction of my company name. My company name is Enlightened Images. So you could Google my name, Gary Crabbe, or Enlightened Images. My web domain is enlightphoto.com, contraction of Enlightened Images Photography, and that's E as in Edward, N as in Nancy, lightphoto.com. And I've got galleries, and I talk about upcoming workshops, and occasionally make blog posts on places I've been or provide photography tips. I've actually been a little behind on that, and I'm looking forward to spring catching up and adding a bunch of new galleries and material on there as well. So, and anyone is free to email me at any time. I'm always happy to try and get back and answer people's questions.
Okay. Well, thanks, Gary. It's been a lot of fun. We'll have to do this again sometime. Still lots of topics in composition alone to talk about, let alone landscape photography. So,
always a pleasure, sir. Always a pleasure. Feel free to invite me back anytime.
I will do that. So look for some show notes on my website at www.flanaganphotos.com. Again, that's spelled FLANAGANPHOTOS.com. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again soon, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.